Hello, hello. Welcome to the channel. Sorry I'm a few minutes late. Summer. That's all I have to say. Summer. We've been doing a little bit better with some routines this week. We'll talk about that a little bit, how we manage all of this chaos of not having our typical routines. Normally at this time is our Tuesdays with Dr. Susan feature. Unfortunately, Susan is not feeling great today, so I let her off the hook. We're going to save that topic of emotional regulation, emotional control for our next stream, which will not be next Tuesday um, due to scheduling issues, but in 2 weeks, we'll be back with Dr. Susan. Sorry, my brain just so today I just kind of wanted to hang out, talk to you about how things been going, some things I'm doing to help with my summer, with my ADHD and with my kids. I've got some articles that I have been piling up that I wanted to talk about, so we might read one or two of those and just answer any questions. Been kind of a lull with Karen Reed wrapping up, sort of. Not a new trial for me to watch. So I don't know. We'll see how things go. But first I'm gonna roll the intro real quick and then we will get into our topics.
Hi, I'm Nicole, and as you have probably guessed, I have ADHD. I live and breathe all things ADHD in my personal, family, and professional life. I have a background in psychology and special education, and I've gained a lot of knowledge over the years about ADHD, what it really is, how it touches every aspect of your life and the life of your child, as well as a wealth of information and strategies for living with ADHD and parenting kids with ADHD. In this community, we share stories, we learn together, and we support each other as we navigate all things ADHD. Welcome.
Alrighty. If you're here, if you wouldn't mind just hitting that like button for me. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We are inching our way towards our first goal, which is 500 subscribers, to get memberships and super chats and those things available. Mostly memberships because I've got a lot of ideas for things that I'd like to do in members only streams. Yeah, I have a lot of ideas for things that I feel like are better suited for a member space rather than just a public space. But we got to get to that 500 subscriber mark. So you're liking the stream and sharing it with people who you think might like to be here is big help for that. So first of all, let's just start with how things have been going. We are in the heart of summer break. And summer is, I have a love-hate relationship with it. I love the warmth. I love summer vacations. I love, we have some, regular travel that we do in the summers, which is great. We're preparing for a family reunion coming up, which is always fun. We've got family who comes into town usually in July, which is just a lot of fun. But I think my oldest gave the best example of why things are so hard at this time. The other day, he was just in the evenings, just having a lot of anxiety that he couldn't pinpoint on anything, which, clinical anxiety does that. It just shows up and you're searching in your brain trying to find something to pin it on. Why am I feeling this way? But there's really nothing there. So we talked about some strategies for that. Go move your body, get those feelings out, and then talked about kind of why it might be happening. So there's a few things that happened in the summer that definitely increased my anxiety, and I've noticed with my kids, their ADHD struggles, their relationship struggle, their anxiety struggles in the summer. First is that change in routine, right? The school year provides so much structure and order, and as much as my kids hate being in school and homework, and everyone wants to be out of school for the summer, that structure and routine helps their brains um, to find kind of a peace and a comfort, right? I know we have this kind of thing with ADHD where our brains really require some of that structure and order in order to be more functional, but we definitely um, struggle to implement it for ourselves and stay in a good routine. And then our brains also crave, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm not finding my words today, and I apologize. Um, we want novelty, right? Dopamine comes from novelty and time. So in the summertime, when when the kids are out of school, right? We don't have that kind of natural where we get up at the same time. We have a structure and order, a schedule. We've got our afternoon activities that are fairly regular, you know, they're extracurricular activities. Again, I'm struggling finding my words today. I apologize. Hopefully, I'll dial in here shortly. I wasn't sure if my brain was ready to come on, but I'm trying to keep myself to this schedule and structure that I have set, and I'm 3 weeks strong of coming live at the same time. So here I am, pushing through the not being able to find my words, and we'll find something else to talk about in the minute that helps me a little bit. Sorry, squirrels. Tangent. Anyway, so the way that I have managed to get us through summer is by creating some of those systems and routines for us, right? My kids have always done swim team in the summer. My oldest doesn't do it anymore because he does marching band, but he is on marching band break right now, so he's struggling a little bit more without that physical outlet and rehearsal schedule. But that gets us that first step, right? Up out of bed at the same time every morning, physical activity for an hour for each of them. They then shower at the pool, wash their hair. When one kid is swimming, the other one is working on their summer homework. We just have a little bit of math practice and then reading a book that they have to do every day. It's part of their daily responsibilities. So we get home and we're off to that good start, right? We've got a few things in. Helps significantly. The next thing that's really been helping us this week, and this is my kind of hooray story, my success story. So, when my oldest was 5 years old, he is now 15, so 10 years ago, we signed him up for a skateboarding program at the local rec center, just for something fun to do. Again, give us that order and structure. It was before we did swim team. And it was something that was every day for a few weeks. We signed up for, I think, 3 sessions. So we were there every morning or every other morning, maybe at the skate park. And it became this really awesome outlet for them. They loved it. My other 2 kids have since started skateboarding. Well, a few years, I guess it's been about 2 years after they started. We were spending most of our summer driving to different skate parks because we didn't have one in our community. So it was a minimum 30-minute drive to get to the skate park. So it was good for us to spend our days there, but I also wanted them to have the opportunity to go to the skate park when I necessarily didn't have 3 hours to take them there, let them skate, drive them home, right? So I started working with my city 8 years ago to build a good concrete skate park, well designed, in our community. Well, this week, my skate park opened. Yeah, it took 8 years. Many visits with the parks department, many visits with city council, at city council meetings and individually communicating with council members, with a local skate park advocacy group, um, design meetings with the skate park designers. Over the last few weeks, it's been trying to keep neighborhood kids off the park until it was finished so that nobody got hurt and stopped the progress on the park. Hold on one second. Jack, he's not here. Sorry about that. Kiddo interruptions. So yeah, we now have a skate park that is very close to our house that my kids can take themselves to. Uh, so exciting. It's not officially, they haven't had an official grand opening, but they're not enforcing trespassing or anything at the park at this point because it is completed. And yeah, it was a long time coming, but when I walked over there and I saw not just my kids, but the whole community um, enjoying the labor, the fruits of that labor, um, I was pretty emotional, to be honest. It was something that was really important to me for a very long time. It obviously took a lot longer than I would have liked, but now we have this amazing result, and it's going to be a huge benefit to my kids to be able to use that outlet, um, that physical outlet to release their anxiety, to help them get that energy out after school for a little bit before they have to start on homework. Our local skate community is incredible and supportive, and everyone's welcome. That hasn't been the case with all the extracurriculars that my kids have taken part in, which has led to some significant heartbreak. So yeah, I definitely didn't start out to be like the Ann Perkins of town, but apparently that's what I am. I have my city council member who is my Leslie Nope, and so excited for that success. So I guess the moral of that story is you can make a difference, even if you don't feel, excuse me, qualified or able. I really didn't know what I was doing. I just did the next thing. I had great support and people who were on my side. But yeah, here we are. Amazing. And if your kiddos are looking for an activity to try, see if you can find a local skate program. Um, skate parks are not what they once were when we were kids, you know, full of delinquents and rough scenes. They are, because all of those kids that were skaters 30 years ago are now adults who want to skate with their kids. It's a really amazing place to be. So yeah, go skate. Let me find the first article I wanted to talk about. I'll swoop real quick because it's fun. Not that we really need it, but we'll just transition a little bit. Whole collection. And I want to find the right one. So sorry, I'm not super prepared today because I had a whole different topic prepared to talk about with Dr. Susan. So shifting gears a little bit. And scrolling through 234 tabs on my phone because I'm not as organized as I would like to be. Anybody else do that? I open it up and then I leave the tab open on my phone so that I can find it later. And because out of sight, out of mind. So if I don't leave it open, I'll forget that I was even looking for the thing. That wasn't it. Gosh dang it. Oh, here's a good one. All right, let's pull this one up. All right, let me pull this on a different window here. And we will share the screen. Please, if you have questions or comments or something you'd like to talk about, feel free to drop it in the chat. Because, it's a random tangent stream. That means we can go wherever we want. It's the one I want to share. So I remember how to push all the buttons. All right. Here we go. This is an article I thought was super interesting. As I've been looking up research and things. I want to do a weekly, I don't know if I'm going to do it as pre-recorded or as a live stream. Let me know what you guys would rather have in the comments or in the chat. Doing just reviewing good peer-reviewed research that comes out on ADHD topics. So if you'd rather have that as pre-record, if you'd rather have that as a live stream, let me know in the chat. So this is The Evolution of ADHD, Examining the Last 25 Years and the Future. All right. I am going to see if I want to make sure I can still see the chat. So, sorry, let me just reconfigure my windows a little bit here. There we go. All right, can you see that okay? Great. All right, ADHD is lifelong. Comorbidities are the rule, not the exception. ADHD doesn't have a single precise cause, and girls and women have ADHD too. These are all things that seem really obvious, right? But these and other findings are supported by the last 25 years of research. Here we look back on how far ADHD has come and what the future holds. In the arc of science, 25 years isn't a long time. Yet, in the realm of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, the last quarter century has been pivotal, yielding myriad advances in our understanding of the condition. Thanks to ongoing research on diagnosis and treatment, we know more about the causes of ADHD, its trajectory, how it presents across different groups, and the treatments that work plus those that don't. We've learned a great deal about ADHD against a backdrop of increasing societal awareness of mental health. We have certainly come a long way, right, in how the world views mental health, it being more and more socially acceptable to talk about mental health struggles, to have mental health struggles. It wasn't that long ago that, there could be serious consequences for talking about your mental health in the workplace, in socially, right? Like, it was honestly not that long ago that we weren't just locking people up for their mental health conditions. And some would argue that we still do that quite a bit with our justice system, but that's a topic for a different day. As important as it is to recognize how far we come, it's crucial to acknowledge the long road ahead. Psychology, after all, is a relatively young science, and there's still so much we have to discover and improve upon, from dismantling stigma to creating equitable access to care for all. Excuse me. All right. So, evolving ADHD, how our understanding has changed. By the way, this article comes from Attitude Mag. It's a great website with a wealth of information, sometimes not super easy to find what you're looking for, which is why I like to kind of bring these articles and highlight ones that I feel like are more useful information, because it has so many articles. It can be a little bit hard to find what you're looking for, but this one is by Dave Anderson, PhD, not a name that I know very much, but Attitude Mag is a great resource. All right. While some aspects of ADHD haven't changed significantly in the last 25 years, like the symptom groupings of inattention and hyperactivity slash impulsivity outlined in various versions of the DSM, following are a few notable changes in the way we diagnose and understand ADHD today. So this is kind of an important thing to talk about, I think. Just the the diagnosis labels that are used and how they are different, right? The ADD versus ADHD, um, inattentive. Anyway, we'll talk about it from subtypes to presentations. So in 1994, the DSM-4 designated three subtypes of ADHD: inattentive, hyperactive, impulsive, and combined. Over time, however, research proved the subtypes unreliable across development. That is, an individual who is diagnosed with a combined subtype as a child could go on to exhibit relatively more inattentive symptoms in adolescence or adulthood, to the point that they no longer meet criteria for the combined subtype. In recognition that ADHD symptoms may present differently across time, subtypes became presentations in the DSM-5 released in 2013. A lot of people and a lot of clinicians still refer to them as subtypes. Um, I don't think that technical language really matters all that much, except in this case right here, of that you may present different one way now and one way another time. That doesn't mean that you no longer have ADHD. Your symptoms might just be presenting differently. So the notion of mental health condition presenting differently across individuals and across time is not new. The symptoms of depression, for example, have hundreds of different combinations, and we still call it depression. The 2013 update made room for this variability in ADHD. Another thing I think that's different from this is they used to refer to it as attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, right? Like you either had the H or you didn't have the H. Now those are all classified under ADHD, with you can have the inattentive presentation, hyperactive presentation, or combined presentation, right? So that I have ADD but not ADHD, that's no longer a thing. They are all categorized under ADHD. So that's why you'll hear people who are teaching about ADHD use that H. A lot of people who were diagnosed a long time ago who were more predominantly inattentive type as opposed to hyperactive type presentation. See, I still say it. I still say sometimes because that's the verbiage that's in my brain. But they think that maybe that information doesn't apply to them because, oh, I don't have ADHD. I just have ADD. They're all the same thing, right? Just they change the labels sometimes. The changing of labels is good. It clarifies things, but it can sometimes cause confusion for people who, were diagnosed a long time ago. Chronic symptoms and remission rates. The last 25 years of research tell us that ADHD tends to be chronic. The majority of kids and teens diagnosed with ADHD will still meet clinical criteria for the condition in adulthood. Today, it's generally accepted that ADHD doesn't just go away. There is some evidence that hyperactive and impulsive symptoms do remit or lessen to some degree over development. Inattentive symptoms largely persist into adulthood and may continue to cause impairment in a variety of ways, from work settings to relationships. While researchers are still learning how ADHD might present and impact individuals in adulthood, both from a strengths-based and impairment approach, more studies are needed on ADHD across the lifespan. ADHD in older adults, for example, isn't well understood. Now, this is one of the biggest myths of ADHD that is still very prominent, right? This idea that ADHD is a kid's disorder, that you'll grow out of it, that adults, if you weren't diagnosed when you were a kid, that you can't have ADHD. A lot of that stems from the fact that we weren't necessarily good at identifying ADHD as well when people were younger. For example, myself, I can look back at those times when I was younger and definitely recognize that there were ADHD symptoms there. Um, but at that time, the way ADHD was diagnosed and identified, especially among girls and especially among twice exceptional people, gifted, it it I was just not identified, right? It was misdiagnosed. It's a common thread with women with ADHD right now and adults with ADHD. I talked before that I run a clinic with my husband, who I refer to as Dr. ADHD here, who like our focus of our clinic is all on neurodevelopment, ADHD, autism, learning disorders. And we see probably just as many adults for evaluation as we do children right now. And probably 2/3 of those adults are women seeking evaluations for ADHD and autism because of this idea, this thought that was so prevalent for so long that, first of all, ADHD was just for boys, or not understanding the presentation of it in girls. But also this idea that you just outgrow it, right? That it's not an adult problem. Well, those of us who have ADHD know that our ADHD doesn't go away. I wasn't even diagnosed till I was 37 ish. I don't know. When was I officially diagnosed? Not sure. That's a story for a different day. Um, but presentation symptoms change, right? The hyperactive kid becomes the really gregarious and talkative and adult, right? For me, my hyperactivity and impulsivity presents a lot in conversation. I interrupt a lot, something you have to work really hard on. There's a lot of reasons for that. Primarily for me, it's that if I don't get this thought out now, it won't be there in 30 seconds. It will have moved on. But also just like that impulse control, just not being able to like stop myself from just saying the thing that pops into my head, right? I refer oftentimes to my brain, my is hyperactivity of thought. The brain's just going and going and going and going and going in a million different directions. And getting it to narrow in where it needs to be is difficult. Medication helps a little bit, but I call it keeping the squirrels at bay. um, and since we have just recently started, in the scheme of things, research wise, understand what ADHD looks like in adults, we certainly don't have this research and clinical experience with older adults. And there's a lot of research out there and a lot of discussion, something I definitely want to look more into. So I'm going to make a note of it right now because, again, the thought will leave my brain and it will never come back. But ADHD, women with ADHD symptoms with perimenopause, hormonal changes that can significantly impact symptoms. I'm going to write this down right now. There's a lot of information coming out now about the effects of perimenopause and those hormonal shifts on women with ADHD, symptoms getting significantly worse. There are also other things that can kind of mimic ADHD, um, things like trauma, dementia, right, where executive functioning is kind of the first thing that's hit. Those frontal temporal lobes is where all those things are developed. And in things like Alzheimer's and dementia, those can sometimes be the first things that are affected. So we're kind of watching that happen with family member right now. Again, probably stories that will be better served in a member space eventually. But this person was kind of in our family known for their executive skills, right? Being able to organize and plan, pack a car for a trip, like spatial awareness, um, and those executive skills have been seriously impacted. And while they're functioning well still, um, it's been such a shift from what we're used to with this person that, it was one of the first causes of concern that led us to kind of work on figuring out what's going on. Still kind of in that process with this family member, but figuring out how ADHD is going to present in elderly patients, and how maybe it impacts sort of other conditions of aging, like dementia, Parkinson's disease, right? Other things that affect the brain. So it'll be really interesting to watch that research come out. I think it is going to probably still be some time because of this issue of, you know, longitudinal studies take a long time, right? Because they're tracking people across a lifetime. One of the best ADHD studies out there is a giant longitudinal study on treatments. Um, and, it's now got, I don't know, 30 to 40 years of data showing, the best treatment options. I imagine we're going to get some data coming out of that same group of studies that will address this issue of what ADHD looks like, in older adults and through the aging process. So, something I expect to see more research on in the next 10 years. And as that comes out, we'll definitely share it. All right, comorbidities are the rule, not the exception. ADHD, we know for sure, rarely presents in isolation. Mood disorders, anxiety, learning differences, and substance use disorders are commonly comorbid with the condition. Shared underlying genetic and brain-based systems could explain the connection, but living with ADHD itself can also cause certain comorbidities to develop. I'll add my 2 cents to this in a minute, but I find this fascinating. Consider that ADHD symptoms remain highly stigmatized. Perceptions abound, or right here for those of you who are reading along, that children with ADHD simply aren't trying hard enough and need to be disciplined. When a child with ADHD is on the receiving end of this kind of negative feedback from parents and other adults, they could go on to demonstrate oppositional, defiant, and/or argumentative behavior towards adults, partly because they have come to believe authority figures aren't on their side. ADHD is also highly linked to peer rejection, academic difficulties, and a host of other negative developmental outcomes that could increase one's risk for a depressive episode or anxiety about one's abilities. So, although individuals with ADHD may be biologically predisposed to comorbid diagnoses, environmental factors can facilitate their development as well. So, this is kind of the chicken and the egg thing, right, with people with ADHD. We know that if you have one neurodevelopmental condition, you're likely to have another. You're more likely than the general population to have another, I should say, because ADHD is a difference in the development of the brain, right? The way the brain develops in utero and in those early first years of life is delayed and different, particularly in the prefrontal cortex. So if you've got differences already there, you are much more likely to have another. So we know common learning disabilities that are also neurodevelopmental conditions like dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculalia. That one's always hard for me to say, so I have to go slower. So those are, specific learning disabilities there. Nonverbal learning disorders, and then also kind of sensory processing issues. Again, things that are related to brain development, autism, spectrum disorders. So those things are all very closely related, right? It can sometimes be difficult to tease out exactly what's happening if you have one or the other or all, right? But this right here, living with ADHD itself can cause certain comorbidities to develop. There's kind of this back and forth, right, with anxiety and depression and ADHD. Um, it's one of the things that when you're starting medications, they tell you to watch out for. And here's the thing about it. I learned this several years ago when we were working on medication with one of our kids, and um, how frequently it is that if you treat for ADHD, right, that you then end up also treating with medication for anxiety. And it used to be the common understanding was that ADHD meds cause anxiety. Now, it makes sense from a physiological perspective, um, for someone who's neurotypical, right? When you take kind of like if you drink too much caffeine, you might get fidgety and anxious, right? But we know that stimulant medications are helping people with ADHD because of the way their brain chemistry is, right? And so it affects them differently. Whereas for me, my ADHD medication, and I know for many others I've spoken with recently, particularly women who were misdiagnosed with anxiety when what they had was ADHD, right? The ADHD stimulant medication actually makes them calm. It quiets that mind, right? So a lot of times what's happening with these medications is not that these stimulants are causing ADHD, but the stimulants are you can hear Charlotte, she's dreaming back there. ADHD medications are unmasking anxiety. Um, I had a psychologist explain it to me that ADHD medication helps you focus on everything, including anxiety and OCD symptoms. So, oftentimes it is kind of a we adjust the ADHD meds, we have to adjust the anxiety meds until you get them to the right balance where those two things are not fighting against each other, right? So, yes, it's extremely common to have these anxiety disorders, in particular depression as well. From my experience, I'm not a psychologist, I just observed a lot from my observations. And I, would love to look into some more research to back up my observations to see if they are true. I'm gonna write that down too. Um, anxiety. Sorry, I had to write it down before the thought leaves my brain. That my observation is that depression is more of this secondary that is often caused by living with ADHD. Um, Anxiety too. It's been hard for me. I have both. It's been hard for me to tease apart is what I'm feeling anxiety just by itself, just anxiety related to nothing? Or is it a manifestation of a pattern from ADHD? For example, one of the things that I sometimes really struggle with is did I remember to close the garage door when I leave the house? There have been many, many, many times where I have called neighbors, can you just look out your window and see if I closed my garage door? Um, And most of the time I have because it's an automatic thing I do and I pull out, hit the button, drive off. But because it's automatic and I'm not paying attention to it, my ADHD brain doesn't remember if I did it or not. And then the anxiety grabs a hold of it because there have been plenty of times where I have left without shutting the garage door, without locking the front door, things like that, that just I'm moving and moving, ADHD forgets to do something. And so there is like a basis to be worried about that thing, right? So it's not like it's an irrational thought. It's not an unfounded worry because that thing has happened. My anxiety will grab onto those things more when it's not controlled. But
is that an anxiety thing, or is that a manifestation of having lived with ADHD and having that lived experience? Um, Kids with ADHD, I think, are more prone to depression. I've seen it in our household. Um, when kids under the age of 10 are on watch for self-harming, there's something going on, right? And it's this right here where we're talking about, right? This negative feedback from parents and other adults. This idea that they just need more discipline, that they're not trying hard enough, or just the fact that they're impulsive and school is not set up for the way their brains work. And particularly in those early years, especially if it's a twice exceptional kid, right? Kiddo who's starting kindergarten reading on a third grade level, they're getting bored and they're getting into trouble. Um, there's research that shows that kids with ADHD receive 12 times the negative feedback of their neurotypical peers. Um, Sounds like a recipe for depression, right? Um, that's what I saw with my own kids in their younger age group. They just felt like there's no way that they were not going to get into trouble. There was nothing they could do. It felt completely out of their control. That they were trying as hard as they could, and they're still getting in trouble. Um, so yeah, my observation and my theory that I'm going to have to look and see what the research says is that that anxiety may come, maybe more of a comorbid condition, but that depression with ADHD seems to happen more often as a result of living with ADHD. In the clinical world, the only treatments that are paid for by insurance, at least in our area, may be different state to state, but the only treatment that is paid for the primary, like if diagnosis number one is ADHD, is medication. They do not pay for therapy. They do not pay for evaluations, comprehensive evaluations for ADHD alone. But 98% of the time, there's also anxiety, some level of anxiety or depression that insurance will pay for. And so that's the way a lot of people are getting, therapy is not for ADHD, even if the anxiety or depression might be secondary to the ADHD in this way, right? It is present and it is there and you can get treatment for it. But it's an interesting, another kind of, that's a rant for another day, is insurance and how it runs the world, particularly in mental health. And it's being directed by people who don't know anything about mental health, as mental health has kind of been taken under the medical model, the pros and cons to that for um, mental health treatment is a rant I could go on for a very long time. But I will not go on that rant today because I need to have sources to back me up. And I don't want to risk getting anyone in trouble. Anyway, that's a squirrel moment. So let's move on. Increasingly complex understanding of ADHD's etiology and outcomes. Our understanding of risk factors for ADHD, including developmental and environmental factors, along with the developmental sequelae of ADHD, has evolved considerably. Look at these big research words. Genetic, environmental, and epigenetic research. We've seen huge advances in our understanding of gene influences on ADHD and other mental health disorders, and the way that environmental factors might exert large effect sizes on the presentation of symptoms. Advancements in epigenetics, the field of research that examines how the environment changes gene expression over time, has helped us move away from the idea of a single cluster of genes that determines ADHD.
There are, in fact, many, many genes that could play a role in the risk profile for ADHD, and those genes are perhaps also shared with many other mental health conditions. One thing is certain from this research: as science evolves, it suggests the answers we seek regarding whether there are objective markers of ADHD or genes that define it are quite likely quite complex. So this is an area that obviously there's continuing research. There's always been continuing research on genetics and finding genetic markers, right? The thing we do know is that ADHD and other neurodevelopmental conditions are highly genetic. 15 years ago, when Dr. ADHD was in grad school, it was a lot of research being done through the Human Genome Project here in our area that he was helping out with, that was talking about what they call the broader autism phenotype. In not very clinical specific language, the broader autism phenotype refers to kind of if you can imagine, like, the family where two siblings are a little quirky, but maybe not diagnosable, and then one's got severe ADHD and one definitely has autism, right? So it's this idea that, like, we've talked it's different now in the way that autism is diagnosed, and the way our understanding of autism spectrum disorder has changed as kind of a spectrum, not necessarily this way, but kind of in all directions, right? But this idea of the broader autism phenotype, that there are families that have these traits in them that don't necessarily meet diagnostic criteria, but that, like, there's definitely something going on. Now, obviously, that's not the, like, clinical academic definition of that broader autism phenotype, but I bet you can think of a family to whom that might apply. This is kind of, as this genetic research continues, we definitely know, especially as more adults and more women who were not diagnosed when they were younger are getting diagnosed. For example, in my family, we have found now 4 generations of women, particularly because my extended family is mostly women. I have a lot of aunts and girl cousins. 4 generations of ADHD in women. We will most likely be participating in one of these research studies before too long. We know there's a huge genetic component that, I mean, this was the way that I first began seeking diagnosis. Was my oldest was diagnosed, my second child was diagnosed. When the second child was diagnosed, the psychologist said to me, okay, if you have 2 in the same family, you have like a 50 to 75% chance that one of the parents has ADHD. And we kind of thought about it a little bit, but didn't really think too much of it until number 3 came along and was diagnosed with ADHD. And my kid's psychiatrist looked at me and said, okay, which one of you is it? That's when we had to take a real hard look when I started seeking my own diagnosis, because as I learned more about ADHD in my kids, I definitely started seeing patterns. But this is a common story for many, 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 many parents, women in particular, who were not diagnosed when they were kids. As their kids get diagnosed, maybe more than one kid gets diagnosed, and now we have to start looking at, where did this come from? And a lot of times it's come from mom who didn't know that she had ADHD. So while we know there's a genetic component for it, all this is saying is that we don't necessarily have one, like, here it is, genetic marker that we can point to through like a blood test. Seems similar to kind of like other cancer genes that they've identified, right? Like there's maybe a handful of genes that point to to breast cancer, for example. So hopefully we'll get a little closer to that in the future. I am going to put you on a brief hold because there's something going on that I need to take care of. So we're going to put on some music and mute my mic here. Sorry about that. Again, summer. Things happen. All right, let's move on to this next section here. ADHD outcomes. Evidence shows that ADHD, especially if untreated, affects multiple domains of life. Individuals with ADHD are more likely to be in traffic accidents, slow down, Nicole, to experience peer difficulties and tumultuous interpersonal relationships, and to drop out of school, be expelled from school, and experience academic failure earlier. Ugh. I thought I was going to sneeze, but it went away. The latter is particularly troubling when we consider that ADHD has historically been under-recognized and undertreated in marginalized and disadvantaged communities. Academic difficulties and expulsions can start the school-to-prison pipeline, which disproportionately impacts Black youth. Individuals may end up incarcerated before ever learning that they have ADHD and that it was the root cause of their difficulties in school and early life. ADHD outcomes for untreated ADHD is a whole topic that I'm going to put that on as another video. And here, this marginalized communities for sure is a huge issue. But it doesn't just affect marginalized kids. It affects all kids with ADHD. Marginalized kids have fewer supports in place. They're already more at risk for these kinds of outcomes. They receive less kind of compassion and understanding for making mistakes than, white boys from affluent areas. But the research shows that the outcomes for even those kids are really, really disheartening. And even greater for twice exceptional kids. I go to the twice exceptionality a lot just because that's where a lot of my experience. I have 3 twice exceptional kids, so that's a particular population that we are actively fighting for in schools right now, is ways to support those kids, because their dropout rates, their rates of incarceration, substance abuse issues, all of that are extremely high. Especially considering their background areas, like they're not kids who would typically be expected to have those kinds of outcomes. They have all of the advantages and they're still having these kinds of outcomes. And, it's this dichotomy of ADHD as a superpower versus ADHD as a disability. And both are true, right? ADHD, when harnessed appropriately, when treated well, when pointed in the right direction, when you can make it through these systems that aren't set up for ADHD, can absolutely be a superpower. There are amazing strengths that come from a brain that works differently, but we are living in a society that isn't set up for these brains, and ignoring the fact that it is that difficult, that it is that challenging, and that outcomes without treatment, and even, with treatment, yes, but without treatment, the outcomes are really scary. The numbers are not good. There's a lot of research on that, and again, that's something that I'd like to do in a separate topic by itself, but it is something definitely that we need to pay attention to. We absolutely need to pay attention to how do we better train schools, doctors, the other people who are in these kids' lives, particularly in these marginalized and disadvantaged communities, to identify what ADHD looks like versus what they think ADHD looks like, and get these kids treatment so that they have that opportunity to get through school. And it's an issue. It's an issue all around for anyone with ADHD. And as we know, all of these issues that impact everyone impact these communities at a higher rate. And it's definitely something that we struggle with as providers, who do not have the ability. There's a large, like if you're in a large hospital system versus a smaller clinic, like we do not have, we can't do a lot of pro bono evaluations. We can't take Medicaid, things like that, because we don't have the, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't have the numbers to absorb the losses, right? But, and this is across mental health, right? Not just, but we definitely do see it in our particular niche, but across mental health, this is a huge issue. It's, wait lists being years long because there's not enough providers. Again, a lot of that, there's insurance dictating things. There's providers who, again, insurance not paying providers enough, so providers then having to go to cash pay in order to make ends meet. And the, marginalized and oh my gosh, words say, those communities, they can't afford cash pay for an evaluation. Even getting into things like ABA therapy, they often require a full evaluation, but you're 2 to 3 years out to get an evaluation for a place that accepts Medicaid. You can't afford to pay cash for it. I mean, it's just, mental health is a mess right now. And I'm not sure what the solution is. We do our best to provide for our community the best we can, to provide levels of care and treatment at different, rates of affordability, in order to serve as many as we can. But we're even not able to provide a lot of the things that we would like to right now because we're too busy and we're trying to not have wait lists that are 12 months out. Provider shortages, people not going into the field because of the rates of pay. It's a huge issue across mental health right now in the US. I'm sure in other parts of the world as well. But again, I'm getting lost in the weeds. I'm going to swoop and get back into the article. It is a random tangent stream. You were warned. Okay, spotlight. Compelling ADHD research today. New diagnostic constructs. Researchers are working to capture certain presentations, possibly in the form of modifiers or subtypes of ADHD. Cognitive disengagement syndrome. Something I haven't heard of. I'm going to have to write this down. Something to look up. Cognitive disengagement syndrome. Characterized by excessive mind-wandering, mental confusion, and slowed behaviors, has been proposed as a potential modifier for the ADHD diagnosis or a subtype. Oh, okay. CDS was previously referred to as sluggish cognitive tempo. Now that I have heard of. And that is another good thing to talk about. Whether difficulties with emotional regulation as well as sleep difficulties represent subtypes or modifiers of ADHD are other topics of research. So it's interesting because if you look at the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, versus things that we know people with ADHD struggle with. For example, nowhere in the diagnostic criteria for ADHD does it talk about executive functioning, yet we know that ADHD is primarily a disorder of executive functioning, right? It's a disorder of regulation, and executive functions are impacted by that. Um, Also, things like, emotional regulation, sleep difficulties. I think the research, last I checked, research showed 70 to 75% of adults with ADHD also have sleep phase syndrome disorder or some other level of sleep condition. Again, not in the diagnostic criteria, but commonly associated with ADHD. So there's all of these things that kind of come with ADHD that I talk about a lot on this channel, but that are not diagnostic criteria for ADHD. So it will be interesting to see as, diagnostic labels are often behind the most current research because number one, they don't come out with a new DSM every year, right? It's 5 to 10 years usually for a new like revision, um, where they kind of change and revisions often change very little. When they come out with a brand new DSM, sometimes there can be large changes, like the last one with the diagnostic models for autism spectrum disorder. But also a lot of things that remain unchanged and just have small language clarifications. But it takes a long time for enough research to be duplicated, to be kind of taken as the new standard, right? As opposed to just new research that informs treatment and care. The difference between kind of changing diagnostic criteria and us changing treatment and new research that like leads us down a new path, right? It's kind of like they talk about the law is so far behind, right? Because it takes a long time to kind of turn a giant ship, and we want to make sure that we're not making frequent little, U-turns. We want to make sure that that any changes that are made are firmly based in a lot of research that all agrees with each other. So always interesting to see how that will adapt over time, and I will keep an eye on research and bring it to you as it comes out. Search for objective markers of ADHD symptoms. Diagnosing clinicians think of FIDI, frequency, intensity, duration, and impairment when considering if a patient's symptoms point to ADHD or, frankly, any other mental health condition. We use this frequency, intensity, and duration as kind of the basis for when you're trying to keep track of any behavior that might need to be changed. When we're doing meetings with schools, right, this is what we talk about. The frequency, the intensity, the duration of the behavior is what we're trying to track. So, and it's the way we kind of discuss things, right? Like what is it that's getting ADHD kids in trouble at school? Is it frequency? Is it intensity? Is it duration of behavior? 9 times out of 10, it's the intensity level for ADHD kids. Again, a topic for another day. ADHD diagnoses today are still largely based on behavioral symptoms and, to some degree, the clinician's subjective impressions of a patient's experience. That's assuming the clinician completes a thorough quality diagnostic interview. Another video to talk about is process and different ways to go about diagnosis. In order to diagnose and meet kind of a basic criteria, there's really only need to have an interview and a brief checklist. However, and this is definitely showing my bias as someone who runs this type of clinic and who is married to a clinical psychologist, I am always proponent, especially, well, in more nuanced cases, less straightforward cases, and how you will do what you will do with the information of a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation. Because again, things that are not necessarily diagnostic, that are frequently common with people with ADHD, show up in profiles on those types of testing. For example, it's very common for people with ADHD to have uh, discrepancies between like their verbal comprehension and their short-term memory or processing speed. Again, not diagnostic. There's nothing in the DSM that says in order to have ADHD, you have to have, short-term memory deficits. But it is a common profile. So it's something that, like, in conjunction with other things found in testing, can be indicative or can help to clarify if it's a complex case. For me, I feel like that all of the information that you get from a comprehensive evaluation is just helpful. More information is more information, and knowing what your individual cognitive strengths and weaknesses are can help you when you're working on coming up with workarounds for your own ADHD. ADHD presents differently in every person. While there are common threads, we all have kind of our own unique way that it impacts our lives and the way that it presents. And knowing kind of what's going on in your own brain just helps. For example, one of my kids has severe ADHD, but his working memory is like off the charts. Again, if that were something that was diagnostically part of the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, he might not qualify, but the kid most definitely has significant case of ADHD. But we can use that short-term memory strength to help him accommodate for some other areas of weakness. So I'm always a fan of getting a full evaluation. However, if you're generally functioning fine, you've got a job that, like, you can manage, you're managing your life, and you don't necessarily need to come up with a whole lot of accommodations, and you just want to get on some meds for ADHD and see if it helps, a quicker, just fill out this one checklist and do a good diagnostic interview can be enough. So, yeah, while I am always a proponent for having as much information as possible, those tests can also be cost prohibitive and have very long wait lists to get in, depending on your area. So, it goes back and forth. Back to the article. Yeah, hopefully we'll make it through. It's been a long one, and hopefully we'll make it through this. If I can stop going off on all of the tangents, because I do have a hard stop. A little later than usual. We should be okay. But I do need to stop rambling. If you have questions, please put them in the comment. Oh, Shima, it's so good to see you in the chat. I feel like it's been a while. I'm glad you're here. Let's see. The question is, are there better markers that can help us objectively diagnose ADHD? Could there be, say, task-based markers or biological markers that would allow us to slow down. My brain's going faster than my mouth. Index risk for ADHD, or at least combine the results with a diagnostic interview to tell us with high confidence if a patient has ADHD. These questions have characterized the last few decades of ADHD research, and while there's hope that we might reach an additive model at some point, the science is not there yet, and we will keep watching. ADHD and sex differences. We've learned a lot about sex differences in ADHD and how symptoms potentially present differently across males and females. It's commonly thought that females may be more likely to present with the inattentive cluster of symptoms and less likely to present with hyperactive impulsive symptoms. At the same time, because of stigma, stereotypes related to gender role presentations, and clinician bias when females do present with ADHD symptoms, those symptoms may be incorrectly or wholly attributed to anxiety or depression. Raise your hand in the chat if you have had this happen to you. Researchers are also studying whether ADHD in females has a different time of onset and severity. There's so much more research that needs to be done on ADHD in women and girls. And I would say, it's commonly thought that females may be more likely to present with inattentive symptoms. I might say that yes, that seems to be true. However, also that hyperactivity looks different in girls. And so, like for me, my hyperactivity was not climbing all over the walls, but it was a mouth that never stopped moving. Starting in kindergarten, I was on behavior charts for not talking in class. And definitely you can it's very it's it's kind of always out there in the TikTok right now. If you are the girl who had has great potential, won't stop talking, you should maybe go get evaluated for ADHD. So I think as we get more research out, the definitions of hyperactivity and impulsivity may become more descriptive and be better inclusive of what women and girls feel like. Um, so again, things that I would like to see. I profile what looks different. We're a lot more research being done over the last 10 years, but definitely still a long way to go. This is an interesting one. Neuroscience. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, has emerged as a tool to identify brain areas, circuitry, or networks that might be implicated in ADHD. Some core research findings have stood the test of time. Frontal structures and networks of the brain appear to be underutilized/underactivated in ADHD. At the same time, the default mode network, brain networks that are meant to be active when an individual is not focused on a task, has been found to be overactive in individuals with ADHD and likely interferes when focus is required. These types of scans are not it's interesting research and it's interesting to look at. At this point, it is generally not believed to be diagnostic. So you can't just go get a scan of your brain and be like, oh, you for sure have ADHD. This is like we have scanned brains that we know of people we know that have ADHD and notice these patterns. But it doesn't go both ways at this point. A look at the field of neuroscience shows how open science has become in the last 25 years. Institutions are sharing their data sets to make for larger combined study data sets, valuable for testing and replicating findings of earlier research. Excuse me. There are also ongoing multiple large-scale national and multinational studies dedicated to understanding brain science as it relates to ADHD and various other mental health conditions. This is an area that I'm really hopeful we'll get a lot more research in the next 10, 20 years. Oh, treatment. In 1998, the evidence base for ADHD treatment was around medication, behavioral parent and school interventions, and combined multimodal treatment. Stimulant medication was known to be effective in addressing ADHD symptoms in children, particularly during school hours, by increasing focus and enabling students to complete academic tasks. It was also understood that coaching parents and teachers on certain behavioral skills could help them manage their child/students' ADHD symptoms through the course of the day, even during hot zones, mornings, homework time, bedtime. Medication and behavioral treatment together were considered more effective than either one alone. That generally stands to be the going recommendations. Both are better, not just additive, right? Like this gets you 10 and this gets you 10 and together you have 20, but more like this gets you 10, this gets you 10 and together you have 40, right? The two together provides exponentially greater effects than either one by itself. Treatment challenges and gaps identified at the time, including the following: the prevalence of non-evidence-based treatments being applied to ADHD, take play therapy, for which there was no evidence that skills learned in the therapist's office transferred to the outside world. This was true in 1998, and it's true today. Play therapy is useful for some things. Evidence shows it is not useful for ADHD. So it says this is not to say there is no benefit to play-based interventions, only that there is no evidence that it helps ADHD. It's great for trauma, other types of things, but doesn't not so great for ADHD. The evidence base was also thin for applying standard individual cognitive behavioral interventions to target ADHD symptoms. That depends on what you're trying to target. Let's just say that. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a wide net, and there are certainly cognitive behavioral therapy can help with certain things, but I'd have to look at the research to see what they're talking about there. The short-term effects of interventions, be it medication or behavioral interventions, questions abounded about the sustained effectiveness of an ADHD treatment, especially once the intervention was removed. The symptom improvement ceiling. In terms of behavior, and this is talking about in 1998 at the start of this, right? In terms of behavior, many interventions for ADHD at the time only brought children within one standard deviation of the typical range for children of their age. So they're getting closer, but they're not quite getting there. ADHD treatment in the present. When developing evidence-based treatment practices, 25 years is a short span of time. From examining a potential intervention in a few cases to executing randomized research trials and replicating results, it takes considerable time and resources to show that a treatment works. Still, there have been important advances in ADHD treatment in the last quarter century. All right, so how has it expanded? More focus on the factors affecting the success of established treatments. A key question researchers are asking today. Does addressing caregivers' mental health concerns improve ADHD treatment outcomes for their children? Proven effectiveness of behavioral peer interventions and organizational skills training. Today, strong evidence shows that these interventions improve these common areas of impairment in children with ADHD. Greater understanding of sequencing of psychosocial and psychiatric interventions. It's well established that medication and behavioral interventions together make for greater treatment outcomes. That said, if choosing to sequence, evidence indicates that starting with psychosocial treatment might produce better outcomes than starting on medication first. That is interesting because that goes exactly opposite to what I have observed in interesting. Because parent training, school training, all right, that makes more sense. As opposed to behavioral interventions with the individual, managing things in the environment first and then medication, that makes more sense. For the kid trying to learn the skills, oftentimes, and the adult, oftentimes medication getting on board first helps significantly because then you're able to actually learn the skills. So, interest in incorporating adolescent-specific techniques like motivational interviewing and collaborative problem solving. This is the Ross Green collaborative problem solving, which is a great technique to use with teens. That's definitely something that we'll talk about with Dr. Susan in the future. Efforts to ensure diverse populations are represented in ADHD treatment research. We talked about this before about including those people, about better identifying those people. And then, this is good for all research. We always need to be better about including different populations in research because what works for one group might not work for another, and we need to know that. Okay, smoke but no fire. ADHD interventions with weak strengths of evidence. Oh, I really am excited about this. A handful of interventions have sprung up over the years, and some have gained popularity for their purported impact on ADHD symptoms. The reality is that, judging by the studies, there is only weak evidence that the following interventions are effective enough to merit considerations as established evidence-based practices for ADHD. Oh, cognitive training. This is also like neurofeedback, right? Computer-based programs that encourage a child to practice certain skills in hopes of boosting executive functions. Doesn't seem to work for ADHD. Neurofeedback does work for traumatic brain injury. Does not work for ADHD. Because it doesn't transfer, it doesn't generalize outside of that setting. Though some encouraging findings show that adults can help mediate the transfer of these skills to real life. So maybe. But here's the thing about neurofeedback. It's insanely expensive. And people often will be like, oh, I'm going to take my kid and do neurofeedback, and that will fix their ADHD so that I don't have to put them on medication. And they're spending thousands of dollars on neurofeedback and getting minimal to no results. It looks in those sessions like you're getting results because they're doing better in that moment, but it doesn't generalize outside of this situation. And you're spending a whole lot of money on something that might have very minimal effects. Thanks for popping in, Shima. It's good to see you. And replay crew is always welcome. And feel free to put me on 1.5 if I am getting boring. Although I am talking a little fast and tripping over my words, so maybe that's not a good thing to do. There's hope that at some point research will indicate more clearly how and whether neurofeedback might be effective for ADHD. However, at this point, there is neither a standardized understanding of how neurofeedback can be applied, nor evidence that it truly generalizes to real-world skills. There it is. Physical activity and taking omega-3 supplements can certainly form part of a healthy lifestyle, but studies do not indicate that these interventions specifically have a significant impact on ADHD symptoms. Physical activity can certainly help for a very short period of time, like sustained intense cardio for like 30 minutes can give you like 10 to 15 minutes of focus. I don't know about you, but I can't do 30 minutes of sustained physical exercise on repeat all day. I will die. Challenges and hopes for the future of ADHD. Ongoing challenges in the field of ADHD are as follows. ADHD is highly stigmatized. To this day, the validity of the diagnosis is still debated. And it's still commonly called as an excuse for laziness and a lack of effort. And yes, I still see this frequently. Along with it's just so that people can drug their child instead of parent. It is enraging to me when I do see it, and is the quickest way for me to like stop taking you seriously about anything you say. If I see someone on any social media platform or other way take this stance, they have lost all credibility, period, on any topic ever. And yes, maybe that's a little overreactive, but it makes me angry because it hurts people. It stops people from getting help. It stops people from seeking evaluation. It stops people from getting treatment. It hurts kids. We talked about those outcomes for kids who don't receive treatment. And it makes me extremely angry. So yes, ADHD is real. You're not lazy, and you can't just try your way out of it. Psychiatric interventions are also heavily scrutinized and stigmatized. Despite decades of research on treatments for ADHD, and the fact that ADHD medications are some of the most well-studied of any psychiatric medication class, there's still a lot of trepidation surrounding them, a shortage of child and adolescent psychiatrists, and an incredible wealth of media narratives about the evils of psychiatry fuel stigma. If your child was diabetic, you would take or you would give them insulin.
If your child needed glasses to see, you would get them glasses. If your child does not produce enough dopamine and epinephrine, they deserve to have medication that helps them. The outcomes of untreated ADHD are scary. And this kind of stuff being spouted hurts people, it hurts kids, and makes me really angry. Mental health parity and access to care remain grave concerns. We talked about this a little bit. Access to care is even more difficult for historically marginalized and or underserved populations, as well as individuals of lower socioeconomic status. We talked a little bit about some of the issues that we see in the clinical world of addressing of why that is. Yeah, it's definitely something that needs to be addressed. Psychosocial treatments require significant investment, whether it's behavioral parent training or organizational skills training. These treatments, while effective, are high effort and usually require ongoing maintenance, a tough task for patients and families. So things like coaching, executive function coaching, can be highly effective, but they do require, you know, insurance doesn't pay for coaching. And it is something that just takes time because you cannot just fire hose it. You have to build skills one at a time. And that can be it can be prohibitive. Use of unproven treatments sets the field and individuals back in many ways. This can be an issue with kind of coaching too. Anybody can hang a shingle and say they're a coach, and they may not have the skills and education to back them up. So be careful when you're seeking help from because coaching is not a regulated field where you have to be licensed, right? But even licensed therapists don't always know how to treat ADHD. When families and patients pursue interventions that claim to help ADHD, like neurofeedback and brain balance, only to find that such interventions are ineffective, the result could discourage these individuals from seeking help and from thinking that they can be helped. At worst, it increases mental health stigma and leads to the development of comorbid mental health concerns. Be careful about choosing interventions. Negative life experiences tied to ADHD may decrease one's ability and willingness to seek help. Individuals with ADHD, especially undiagnosed, are vulnerable to peer rejection, academic failure, and other unfortunate outcomes that can cut off avenues for help. But across the board, the future of ADHD looks bright. There is much to be excited and hopeful for. All right, we're getting close to the end here, which is good because I have kiddo stuff to do here pretty soon. ADHD science and treatment continue to advance. Evolving tools and science will help us further understand ADHD and ultimately allow us to go beyond today's largely behavior-based approach to diagnosing the condition. There is good reason to believe that the future of ADHD holds precision medicine, the ability to better delineate risk factors for the condition, and a tailored course of treatment for individuals. A major priority is expanding the mental health workforce. Yes, please. And recruiting diverse and representative clinicians to meet patient treatment needs. The field is also envisioning novel ways to reach patients, such as capitalizing on telehealth. Telehealth has been huge in making mental health care and ADHD diagnosis available to people who have a hard time getting into an office during 9 to 5 work days. Telehealth is going to be changing a bit because there have been some drawbacks to that, but we'll see how that goes. In the larger scheme of treatment, we see interest in the development of intensive interventions, treatments that are shorter in term but just as effective in reducing symptoms and impairment. Again, as this research comes out, I will bring it to you. Societal awareness of ADHD and turning tides. Yes, ADHD is stigmatized, but awareness and acceptance have undoubtedly improved over the last 25 years.
and efforts are ongoing to fight stigma and build equity in mental health care. The changing ways we talk about mental health are evidence of these efforts. We're opting for neurodivergence and other non-stigmatizing terms to capture individual differences and the inherent diversity of human brain function. For the future of ADHD, perhaps the greatest hope of all comes from the growing societal belief that mental health care is a fundamental human right. Some other articles to read here at the bottom, but that is that. I'm going to take this down and wrap up a bit. So if you have any questions, if you're on replay crew, so happy to see you here. Please put your questions and comments in the chat, comment on the video. Remember to like and subscribe. It helps us so much. I really want to get to that 500 subscriber goal so that we can start doing some membership opportunities. I've got some great ideas for things I'd like to do in there. Things that are not necessarily appropriate for public consumption, but would be great in a members only space. Book clubs, sharing a little bit more personal things that I don't necessarily want to be totally public. Putting it behind that membership wall helps a little bit with that. If you have any questions, if something resonated with you as we were talking, please put it in the comments. Your chats, your questions help drive the content that I create here. Let me know if you prefer live stream or, shorter form videos pre-recorded. Let me know what you'd like to see. Again, next week on Tuesday, we will be off, but we will be back the following Tuesday with Dr. Susan to continue our talk about executive functioning. Love to see you here for that. The next topic is emotional control. So if you have questions about that, send them our way. And I'm going to run the outro, but before I do, remember that you are not broken. You are not alone, and you are doing better than you think you are. Have a great Tuesday, and we will see you next.
Thank you for watching. If you haven't already, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. This video is not a substitute for counseling, psychotherapy, medical, or mental health care. The information and advice shared here should not be used in place of any form of diagnosis, treatment, or therapy. Information provided here does not involve diagnosis or treatment of medical or mental or psychological disorders. If you feel the need for professional support, please seek a local professional in your area. This video is for educational and entertainment purposes only.